Add and subtract integers today, and there's three things you should know. A positive and a negative add to 0. So I'm going to use yellow for positive and red for negative, and when I have a positive and negative, it equals 0. That's it. You can't take away what you don't have. So if you're trying to take something away and you don't actually have it, that's impossible. But you can always add the opposite. Yellow is positive, red is negative. So I'm just going to get in here, and I'm going to use these little tiles as my manipulative. So this is positive 3. So I'm going to do this very first example here. This is positive 3, and I'm going to add 2 more positives. 1, 2, and so when I have a positive 3 and a positive 2, they add to positive 5, and that's not surprising. Nobody should be surprised by that. All right, well, I have positive 3, and I add 2 negatives, 1, 2. Remember, the positive and the negatives go to 0. So now I have only one positive left. So let's see, what's my next question here? Oh, so I end up with a, positive 1. Now, this one here, I have positive 3, and I'm going to take away 2 negatives. I'm now on this question here. Positive 3, so I have 3 yellows. Take away 2 positives. Well, if I take away 2 positives, I'm just left with 1 positive. And what I'm hoping you'll notice is that 3 plus a negative 2 is the same as 3 minus a positive 2. So now I'm going to do my last one. It says positive 3, take away 2 negatives. Well, so I need to start with positive 3, and I need to take away 2 negatives. But if you look at my picture right here, this is all I have. I only have 3 positives. I can't take away 2 negatives because I don't have 2 negatives. But remember what I said in the very beginning. I said you can always add the opposite. So the opposite of 2 negatives would be 2 positives. And that was unfortunate. So I can add 2 positives. And when I do that, I end up with positive 5. So I'm hoping that kind of makes sense. Now, what if we start with 3 negatives? And I am going to go through this kind of quick, and I do apologize about that. It's because I don't want to make this video super long. So if I start with 3 negatives, and now I'm going to be working on these green questions down here. I'm going to start with this one here. I have 3 negatives, and I'm going to add 2 positives. Well, if I add 2 positives, remember, a positive and negative add to 0. So I'm left with 1 negative. Negative 1. If I start with 3 negatives, and I'm going to add 2 negatives, what do I have? And I'm hoping you're saying, oh, you have 5 negatives. That's right, it's a negative 5. All right, well, let's say I start with 3 negatives, right down here, and I'm going to take away 2 positives. Well, once again, you can see I don't have 2 positives to take away. So what's the opposite of taking away 2 positives? It's adding 2 negatives. So once again, when I count them, I say, well, what do I have now? I have 5 negatives. And I'm hoping that's starting to make sense a little bit. We're going to do a couple more questions. Now I'm on this last one. I have negative 3, and it's telling me to take away 2 negatives. Well, all right, I can do that. If I have negative 3, that's what I'm starting with, negative 3. And now I have to take away 2 negatives from this negative 3. And what am I left with? Just 1 negative. All right, well, I'm going to need some more tiles down here because I'm going to do a couple more problems. So now, what if we start with the 2's? All right, so I'm going to start with 2 positives. And it says 2 positives, add 3 positives. 1, 2. I'm going to start with 2 positives. I add 3 positives, and what do I have in total? 5 positives. And that's it. Now, let's see. This one here, it says start with 2 positives and take away 3 positives. Well, I can't take away 3 positives because I don't actually have 3 positives. So what's the opposite of taking away 3 positives? How about adding 3 negatives? 1, 2, 3. And when I do that, remember, positive and negative add to 0. I'm left with 1 negative at the end. Now, I'm going to go back. Let's see. I'm going to start with my 2 positives. I'm doing 2 positives. I'm going to start with 2 positives. I'm going to add 3 negatives. Well, we just did that. We just added 3 negatives. 1, 2, 3. And like I said, we just did this. We still get a -1. And like I said, I'm starting to hope that you notice that those two always end up being exactly the same. All right, so now if I start, last one here, at 2 positives, and I take away 3 negatives, well, I don't have 3 negatives to take away. So in order to rectify that, instead of taking away 3 negatives, I have to add 3 positives, because that's the opposite. And I end up with 5 positives. So the opposite of taking away is negatives is to add positives. All right. We have 4 questions left. And then we'll be done with this example. So let's move these tiles down. Last 4 questions. I'm going to start with 2 negatives. And I'm going to add 3 positives. 1, 2, 3. Now, I hope you're recognizing that these are going to go to 0. And I'm left with 1 positive. Here, I'm going to start with 2 negatives, and I'm going to take away 3 positives. Well, I only have 2 negatives. I can't take away 3 positives from that. So what's the opposite of taking away 3 positives? How about adding 3 negatives? And when I add 3 negatives, how many negatives do I have now? There's 5 of them. By the way, you can make your own strips by using just regular paper. So if I start with 2 negatives, and then I add 3 negatives, I get the same thing. 1, 2, 3. I get 5 negatives again. And then my very last one, I'm going to start with 2 negatives. I'm going to take away 3 negatives. Well, I only have 2 negatives to start with, so I can't take away 3 negatives. But I can add the opposite. Instead of taking away 3 negatives, I'm going to add 3 positives. And when I do that, positive and negative adds to 0. I'm left with 1 positive. And that's it. That's how this works. Remember, you can always add the opposite. If you can't take something away that you don't have, then you're in good shape, all right? That's all. Thanks.